Hi everybody, this is John Sneisen here from World Alternative Media, and today actually we're in beautiful Phoenix, Arizona, and of course we're attending the Freedom Force International Congress, which has the topic global warming and inconvenient truth. Now, today actually me and Mr. Tim Bull, which is going to speak at the event, we're actually not going to talk too much about the global warming topic, but we're going to talk about something even more interesting that I had a great honor to have a conversation with him over lunch for, and that was the history of why people are standing up and why that is happening. So, of course, I just want to introduce you, Tim Bull. You're, of course, a retired professor at the University of Winnipeg. You've earned a Doctorate of Science at Queen Mary College, University of London, and was on the chairman of the Canadian climate fluctuation, a chairman of the Winnipeg Advisory Committee on Hazardous Waste, and you, of course, have authored over 53 scientific papers, and you are the author of the book The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. And yeah, I want to welcome you to our show, Mr. Bull.
Thank you very much. And of course, as people are noticing, with snow, very early snow in Japan and in Spain, and record colds around the world, we're starting to see that global warming is another undelivered government promise. so yeah, that's about all we need to say about global warming today. Yeah.
So let's get into the interesting conversation that we had. I was just, my ears were just going, and I was just extremely excited to listen to some of your deep insight into the topic of, why people are putting up a resistance and why people stop these leaders that, evolve over time. So can you go a little bit into what you believe and what is your insight into what makes that happen?
Yeah. Okay. Just to give some idea that I am qualified on the basis of extensive research in this. One of the things, my interest in historical climate and how climate changes through time was particularly the impact of climate change on the human condition. And of course, out of that, a couple of things emerged. One was I realized that droughts were one of the most serious climate events impacting humans, and in fact were the major trigger of the ending of civilizations. And you think about the Anasazi people in the American Southwest here, and so on. But also it led me into water resources, and I think that water, they're already talking about peak water, and it's going to be the next big issue. It's not a big issue, but they'll make it one. But I wanted to change the name of the planet from Earth to water because I think it's a better.
Yeah, well, it is about 75%.
Yeah, 70% oceans, and then about 1% on the land.
Yeah,
and it's about what life. They claim life is about, and of course, whenever NASA they go to other planets, what they're looking for is water because they think that's the basis. That's assuming that their model of life is the model here on Earth, which is another of their arrogant assumptions. But that's the way it goes. But what my interest in the impact of climate on the human condition led me into was political geography, and I wanted to teach a course, and I wanted to call it geopolitics. But in the 70s, the university wouldn't allow that because the word geopolitics had come out of Nazi Germany. It was that you won battles and you won wars by understanding the terrain and using the terrain to your advantage. So, of course, that was still off the scales in terms of... So I called it political geography. And the idea is that you can study geography separately and you can study history separately. But only when you put the two together do things really start to make sense. So geography is the stage and history is the play that's played out on that stage. And one of the things that really triggered this was during the Israeli invasion, the war with Egypt. And I'm listening to the reports, and they kept talking about the armies moving through the Negev desert and through the mountains. And the Israelis had controlled the Gida and Mitla passes. And I'm thinking, I know those names from somewhere. But of course, you go back to the Bible, and they're talking about if you're going to control this part of the world, you've got to control the Gida and Mitla pass. And I'm thinking, but don't we have rockets and modern warfare, but the terrain was still dictating the outcome. And the other part of it that made me think about this was the French have always combined geography and history. They don't separate the two. And a French geographer by the name of Simon, in his diaries, was writing as a soldier in the First World War, and he's tromping through the mud and walking along these highways, and he's seeing signs go by, and it suddenly dawns on him, he said, that sequence of names on those signs, I've seen that before. And of course it dawns on me that these are the routes that all armies have marched throughout the whole of history. So that's what got me interested into the political thing. But more specifically to your question, I think that the final phase of the American revolution is underway right now, and that is the access to information. And despite all of the attempts by the mainstream media to divert the public and get Hillary Clinton to win, the public had now their own source of information. They had the access through the internet. And of course, it's why people like Obama are trying to control or shut down the internet. They have to control the information flow. So those factors are part of it. But the other part is that when I've looked at the history of the development of civilizations and declines of civilizations, it was all triggered for me by graffiti in Pompeii, in the city of Pompeii, which was going through an election at the time of the eruption. And so one of the pieces of graffiti says, if we get rid of this bunch of scoundrels, we just get another bunch of scoundrels.
It sounds like politicians.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, it's the cynicism that people have that, and of course it's related to, they all go in there with good intentions, but as Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah, and it doesn't take long. No. It doesn't take long. And so this led me to thinking about, well, are there times when the people will throw out the scoundrels? That they have to send a message to the leaders that you're failing. And by the way, another part of my course in political geography was all about terrorism and guerrilla warfare and all that stuff. See, because and I'll show you how this relates in a minute, but people say, well, terrorists, they're blowing up the citizens. The citizens are going to be mad at them. How does that help you take over the people? That's not the point at that stage. The issue at that stage is to get the people to think that their government cannot protect them. That's what terrorism is about. You don't care about what the people are thinking about it at the time. It's that undermining the trust you have in your leaders. And of course then that's followed by what's called the insurgent state stage, where you set up headquarters within the state that you want to take over. And they are places where the authorities can't go. And of course that phase of that is what the mosques are. They are the insurgent states in Europe and in America. Mm-hmm. And of course they are no-go zones for the authorities.
Yeah, some places I know in Europe is definitely no-go zones.
And now there are authorities that are saying, we don't care, we're going to go in there because you're using them for the wrong purpose. And that's a whole interesting thing about, and you see it with the sanctuary cities in the United States, the same idea. But anyway, so I'm looking at what causes people to say, no, the scoundrels have got to go. And the primary reason is failure of the food supply. And
very
of course,
interesting.
Yeah, and you can go back and read, and I've read the translated versions of the hieroglyphs in the pharaohs' tombs. And of course, the pharaonic regimes, although it went over about a 5,000 year period, each pharaonic regime was about 300 years. And that's related to a precipitation cycle in the Middle East. So the precipitation increases, the food supply increases, and then it starts to decline. The precipitation starts to decline again. And then what that does is it aggravates the problems that humans have. That is, it increases soil erosion, and it increases the salinity in the soils, so that you lose productivity, both because nature's changing and because of what humans have done.
Yep.
And so the pharaohs brag on the walls of their tombs, or at least they get their people to brag for them, that they saved the people through particularly severe food shortage times. A more recent example, of course, the French Revolution. The hostility between the peasants and the aristocrats is still there today. It was there forever. But what happened was in 87, partly because it was a cold period of climate, but also because of a volcanic eruption called Laki in Iceland. Mm-hmm. And it erupted for 10 months.
Oh, wow. So, it was massive,
on. So it just pushed out. And by the way, Benjamin Franklin, who was sailing by, watched it and said, that's going to cause harvest failures in Europe. And Franklin's knowledge was mm-hmm. unbelievable.
Wow. Yeah.
The perceptions. But anyway, so by 1787, about 50% of their income, the peasants' income for just bread. By 1788, it's up to almost 90% just for bread. And so, of course, they have a very harsh winter of 88, 89, and in June of 1789, they storm the Bastille, and the whole French Revolution is on.
Yeah.
And so that's what triggered it. In today's world, where you can see it, is in Egypt, what Obama called the Arab Spring, with the riots in Egypt, were in fact food riots. And they were triggered by Obama's putting subsidies into the production of ethanol. So the farmers were directing all of their corn into the ethanol plants rather than into the food supply system.
Yeah.
And it pushed the price of corn up. And of course, once a major commodity like that goes up, it pushes up all the other prices.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right? And so in Egypt, the people rioted against Hosni Mubarak. And Obama, skillfully, that's what's frightening about these people, is they're very clever. He called it Arab Spring and said, no, this was democracy underway. It's just absolute rubbish. But he wanted to get rid of Hosni Mubarak and put the Muslim Brotherhood in power.
Exactly.
Which he actually achieved.
Yeah.
And now, of course, the people then, the army rose up. And
we've seen that as well. Yeah.
And notice, by the way, very little resistance to that around the world. Obama didn't say very much at all about that. But anyway. He tried something. It was like with the Russians putting the missiles into Cuba. Hey, if we get away with it, fine. If we don't, hey, it's worth the gamble. You take those military risks every once in a while. And anyway, the more recent example, well, the Egypt one in 2008 and 10, but Venezuela right now.
Oh, totally, yeah.
The real disaster there.
Yeah, it's very sad to see in Venezuela because people, I believe people are ill prepared, and we talked about this where like having your own food supply anymore doesn't exist whatsoever. I remember studying the Great Depression even just like very recently, and 90% of the people lived on the countryside and were more and less self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the 10% lived in the city. Now it's the opposite. 90% lives in the cities, and they're not even self-sufficient at all. And you have only 3 days of supply usually in the stores. So what people don't understand, if you don't have that food supply, because food is your fuel. That's what makes you live. If you don't have fuel, you're going to be eliminated.
But even on a short-term basis, and we've practiced this at home for a long time, if you have a reserve, you can also, when prices go up briefly, you can say, well, I can afford to wait till the price goes down.
Yeah.
So just on a short-term basis, it benefits, but on a long-term basis, of course, it has a huge, and that's why any of the people that are into this whole survival mode and long storage of food and so on. And by the way, one of the methods of storing food, which was being studied out at Pinawa, at the atomic energy station out there. I worked with some of the people out there because they wanted to use the CO2 argument for what they were doing to justify the funding. But the irradiation of food can store it virtually, shelf life is enormous. But the lobby, the green lobby, said no. They got the government to agree that they would only allow irradiated food if it said radiation on the package, which they knew was enough to scare people away.
Yeah.
And so you know, and people like Ben Burke at the Department of Agriculture out at the University of Manitoba I also worked with him on storing very large volumes of food in the permafrost up at Churchill.
Okay, yeah.
You know, you just dig a trench and you got natural refrigeration, and Ben studied about 100 different foodstuffs that you could store virtually forever at those temperatures. And of course, with the runway there at Churchill and the port, if there was a food shortage anywhere in the world, you could immediately provide for it. The government wouldn't allow that, and the market wouldn't allow that because, of course, it would control prices.
Yeah.
And they didn't want that. And so that's another interesting side of this. But anyway, so the failure of the food supply will trigger immediate response. People will throw the government out. Yeah.
Because what I've seen also in the Arab Spring, it also creates an economic issue where people, like the governments, need to print more money into the system, and then you have like the prices just rises so rapidly that you will get this rise, and it's when people can't afford to get food for their money. That's when I seen, like, throughout history, the not as far as you studied back all the way back to the Egyptian empires, but I studied about 2,000 years. It shows, you know, and it's so important.
Yeah, well, of course, one of the ways that you get around it is you print the money, or you borrow the money, or whatever you do to get the money into people's hands, but that creates the massive inflation.
Yeah.
The Weimar Republic, of course, where, you know, people had a wheelbarrow full of marks in order to get a loaf of bread. The same concept. So the government solutions, very, very rarely do the government solutions solve the long-term problem and exacerbate the short-term problem, and so that's what happens. Yeah, but of course the other thing that people need to understand is that the Industrial Revolution was preceded by an agricultural revolution.
Yep.
And so the increase in food production in Britain is what allowed the people then to go and live in the cities and rely upon foodstuffs being brought into the cities. And of course that generated the railway traffic, which transported the foodstuffs into the cities. But that creates the dependency of the city on the countryside. And it's going on in Japan or in China right now. The massive migration of people into the urban
cities,
centers. And yes, it gives you a job and it creates income, but then you've got to buy the food, and the people are disappearing from the countryside that actually are making the food. Making it. Okay, yeah. Now, I should mention to your audience, because we talked about this, that I was in Lloydminster and there was about 1,000 farmers there. And by the way, the speaker ahead of me said to them, how many of you took over the farm from your parents? And virtually everybody put their hand up. And then they said, how many of you are your children going to take over the farm from you? And only about 20% put their hands up. Yeah. The average age of farmers on the prairies in Canada is there's more farmers over 70 than under 30.
Yeah, and I actually seen this also. Yeah. What I've seen lately, like I only lived there for 7 years, but I've seen more and more farms. Actually, there's a big 40-acre farm that just came up sale right beside me, and it's that generation dying off, and they can't pass it off to anybody because there's no interest of having a farm.
One of the problems with it, of course, is that you get corporate farming. Yeah. And now you can argue that that's what the Hutterites are doing, but this is companies. I know Swift were buying up huge tracts of farms across the prairies, so you got that loss of control. But at the Lloydminster, and by the way, when I got up to speak, I teased them and I said, the joke on the prairies is, what's the definition of child abuse? And the answer is leaving the farm to the children. So I said, you've been telling these kids for 40 years there's no future on the farm, so don't be surprised that they're leaving.
No, exactly, right? Yeah.
But what happens, and I've seen this, and many of your audience will know this, that they go to the city, and then they get tired of the city, and then they say, well, I'm going to go back home and run the farm, but Dad's already sold it.
Yeah.
So you get that problem. The other thing, by the way, is really chauvinistic, is that they never think of leaving the farm to the daughter.
Yeah, why?
Unless the daughter marries a guy who's going to farm it for them.
Yeah.
But with the machinery now, women can run the farm.
Oh, 100%. It's very easy.
It's all part of that thing.
It's not like super hard labor anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
but that idea of moving to the city to get the jobs to be able to survive, and I used this phrase first at that Lloydminster convention, was that there are no farms in the cities, but there are no cities without farms. And what triggered it was that I also raised the point to those farmers. I said, look, they said, nobody's listening to us. Nobody knows what's going on the farm. Well, there's several things you can look at. 30 years ago, every paper across the West, and in fact most of Canada, had an agricultural section. They don't even mention it now. Even in the Leader Post or the Winnipeg Free Press, it's not there. And of course, the other thing is that up until the last 30 years, most of the people in the city had either come from the farm or their parents had come from the farm. So there was still a connection. That's gone now. We're into a generation that has no relationship.
Yeah.
And when I was chairing the Assiniboine River Management Board, and when I talked to my board, I said, one of the things we've got to deal with here is what is known in rural Manitoba as perimeter vision. And perimeter vision is defined by rural Manitobans as the distance that Winnipeggers can see. Because for your audience that is not from Winnipeg, there's a highway built around the city called the Perimeter Highway, exactly. And Winnipeggers can't see beyond that.
That is very true,
right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I had evidence of that because I would hold meetings for my board, either Brandon or Winnipeg. Well, if it was in Winnipeg, it started at 9 o'clock sharp. But if it was in Brandon, it was at noon because Winnipeggers needed time to drive to Brandon.
About 2.5 hours.
Right, yeah. And I used to tease it. I said, well, you always know somebody from Brandon at the meeting because their eyes are burned out driving into that early morning sun from
exactly from the east. Yeah.
So all of these evidences of it, but that so the detachment of the city from the farm, and I said to these farmers in Lloydminster, I said, look, 62% of Torontonians were not even born in Canada. So it's not that they don't know that they don't even know you exist. They can't relate to your problems. And they go to the supermarket and they say, what problems on the farm? There's food here. Yeah. And of course it's coming from all over the world and so on. And so this shift and detachment, we're now at the point where in Stats Canada, only 2% of the population are listed as officially recognized, and that's in the tax code thing, as farmers. And so you've got 2% of the people producing enough food for the other 98%, with food left over to export. And that, ironically, is that the farm community have been so successful that they've created their own problem. Right? So when they do get problems on the farm, and that 2%, and who's the politician going to list to? The 62% in Toronto, who in total number represents 6 of the Canadian provinces combined, and so on. So the food thing and the shifting of that, and by the way, when you study history, the collapse of the Maya, the Inca, all of these civilizations, it's all because of the surplus foods created, cities are formed. In fact, the word civilization means city in the original terminology. But then the food supply starts to fail out there and the cities start to collapse. And once the people in the city start to lose trust and confidence in their society, the whole thing just collapses. Yeah. Because it is all about trust. And I was teasing a lawyer the other day, and I said, because he was giving me a hard time, and I said, you guys have destroyed society. He said, well, how can you say that? And I said, because society's about trust. And you're telling everybody, don't trust anybody. Get a contract, and I'll write it for you. And by the way, there's an interesting story about that. One of the best students I ever had got into a faculty of law. And he took a course in contract law from the best contract lawyer in Canada. And the guy's opening remark was, if you sign a contract, there's no problem. If you don't sign a contract, there's no problem. We'll now have a course in contract law. So, what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point?
What's
exactly,
the point? But anyway, so the that whole idea about the food supply and the dependency, and you and I talked about the Mormons, their religion requiring that 1 year of food supply is maintained within the home. So it makes good sense. But the other reason that people have got rid of the scoundrels is when the message becomes in your face clear that the leaders and the people in power believe that they are superior, that they're elite, that they know what's good for people, and that they believe that they don't need the people's approval to be in power. And so in the old days, of course, when we changed leadership effectively by beheading the kings, and we need a guillotine at Portage in Maine again, I think. But anyway, I'll get tacked for that comment.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there you go. We got to be politically correct.
Yeah, political correctness. So you don't have to worry about that on our show.
No. In fact, I'll strive not to be, because we need it now.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
And anyway, so when James I wrote a book, The Divine Right of Kings, and he's saying that the king doesn't need the crowning of the people, that God has given them the crown, and of course they kind of tolerated that because James was the first of Scotland and became the 6th of England, and they kind of gone through some problem times, and so they kind of put up with it. But then when his son Charles I took over and perpetuated the idea, and Charles, very interesting. If you go to the Houses of Parliament in Britain today, there is one part of the Houses of Parliament that the Queen is not allowed to go.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that is the House of Commons. Mm-hmm. The royalty are not allowed in the House of Commons. What they will do when the Queen opens Parliament is she goes into the House of Lords, and the Commons comes over and sits in the House of Lords. And that was because of Charles I. And Charles I wasn't getting his way. He wanted money to fight wars and build palaces, and the people were starting to say, no, we're not going to do that. Yeah. Well, he marched right into the House of Commons and said, here's what you're going to do. I'm demanding this of you. I'm telling you I've got the divine right of kings, and this is what we're doing. And of course, that's why they now no longer allow the monarch into
that is very interesting.
It's that reminder of history, that, hey, you got to know your place, even though you're the monarch. And of course, then Louis XVI, when he said, "I am the state," and they chopped his head off too. And so I think that's what happened with this Trump election.
Yeah, and the politicians and media and everybody running against that whole thing.
And what was interesting was that it was both ends of the political spectrum. It was the elites of the left and the elites of the right that triggered that. And so, of course, Trump comes in, and he called it a movement, which it was, but it was a middle class revolution. Yeah. Right? I remember somebody said to him, "What about the Tea Party?" And he effectively said, "I don't need the Tea Party because I've got right-wing Democrats." So he said the 20% there I don't care, I don't need, which was the Bernie Sanders group, and then the 20% over here, which was the Paul Ryan group, and I'm going for the people in the middle. And the elites didn't get it. I mean, they called him a populist. Well, what is a populist? Well, a populist is somebody who tries to do what the majority of people want. Isn't that democracy at the very heart of democracy? Yeah. But of course, you see what's gone on with the elites is they've created, and the liberals have created this idea that you've got to allow the minority voice. Well, yes, but what we've gone is from tyranny of the majority to tyranny of the minority. Yeah. And that's what people are protesting about, and of course then the liberals in the minority are saying, oh yeah, you're going to walk roughshod over us, and the campaigns against Trump are all this, but no, he's a true populist, and when the ordinary people start describing him as the people's billionaire, it's a wonderful common sense understanding of what the relationship is. And by the way, unlike Romney, who was ashamed of his success and wealth, Trump is proud of
we've
it.
seen Trump. Well,
And in fact,
Yeah.
and you know how he's been able to do that? Because he said, "Hey, I've made billions, but I want you to make billions too."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
And of course it's what I call what I call the Canadian immigrant policy or philosophy, and I can say this because I are one. And it is, I'm in, close the door. I got what I want. You go away. And Trump is not doing that with his wealth. He's saying, I want everybody to be able to make $1 billion, and that would be real success. And so we're seeing the final phase of the American Revolution, because they had the free speech, which the founding fathers knew was under jeopardy, not because of other governments, but because of their own government. They saw that it was the people's government that was the greatest threat, which again is what Trump is saying, which is what that whole divine right of kings thing is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, okay, we have a militia, and they can have guns that, if necessary, to get rid of the government that's tyrannical, you form your militia and you get rid of them. And by the way, a lot of people don't know that the Second Amendment not only has the right to bear arms, but the citizens must billet the army at their own expense. That's still in the Second Amendment, but that part never gets mentioned.
That is interesting, isn't it?
So that once that militia army is on the move and it needs to stay somewhere, well, you as a citizen must provide for them. Yeah. And so it really is an interesting aspect of it. But anyway, I've been babbling for a while.
No, it's very true. So, like, what it comes down to is it's the food supply, and then, of course, the lack of income from the government the government through taxation, so they have to print money. We saw that in the French Revolution and so on. So it's a huge connection between the important commodities like water and food to human civilization and our survival. Because we talked about this at World Alternative Media all the time. We say how important it is to have your food supply and have your water. Of course, we can talk about gold and silver, but that should be a second, because it's a little bit of a wealth insurance.
There's two things about gold. Gold is useful as long as the system is functioning. Yeah. But they're selling it, saying, "Oh, you need it if the system functions or doesn't function." Yeah. But once it dysfunctions, then the gold, you can't eat gold. No. Right?
No, it won't do very much good.
And not only that, but the guy with the AK-47 is going to come and get your gold anyway. Yeah. But here's the other important thing about gold. It doesn't generate wealth, right? It's the same thing as military equipment. You build a tank, it just sits there and depreciates. Yeah. Whereas if you build a tractor, it does other things and generates other wealth. Yeah. And that's the problem with gold. So you can have your gold, and as long as the gold price is increasing, fine.
But when the collapse is coming, you better be prepared with other things.
Right, and it's the same. It's the same as this strange mentality people have in the housing market. So, I paid this much for my house, and now it's worth this much. I say, yeah, okay, but only if you sell it. And if the market's going up, you sell it. The next day, you won't be able to afford your own house.
Yeah. Actually, one of the reasons why I got into this is a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad from Robert Kiyosaki. I don't know if you're familiar. He actually says, your house is not an asset until you either sell it or you actually have more income coming in than you pay for your mortgage.
Right. Well, I'm old enough to remember that if you lived in your house and sold it for the same price that you paid for it, you figured, hey, I lived there for free. Now, if you don't make $100,000, you figure you're getting ripped off. Yeah. This is the whole change of mentality.
It's an insane mentality, and I do believe it's the policy of these Keynesian economists that are out there that have been pushing the agenda of trying to create like a state of people feeling wealthy with real estate and the stock market going up, but they've been pushing it with low interest rates, to really like push up the prices. It is not so much your house that have appreciated in value, but it is actually your money that have depreciated in value. Your house usually stays the same or depreciates even in value.
Yeah. I have a friend who's money manager in Winnipeg, and I say friend very proudly because he was a former student of mine. So for a professor to have a student who's still a friend is something. But we talked about for hours about who did well, who survived the crash of 29. Who are the people that survive these downturns in the economy? And it really comes down to a few things. One is no debt, cash, and what was the third thing? Well, the land values, of course, if you own property, because as Will Rogers said back in the 30s, land's the best investment because they ain't making it anymore, you know.
No, yeah, so, it doesn't come more than we have today.
And by the way, that links back to something else we talked about earlier. The American Revolution was free speech, and I interpret free speech even more literally than the American Supreme Court did. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, oh, you know, you can't shout fire in a theater, crowded theater. I don't agree with him. You can shout fire.
Yeah.
The problem is you got to be held accountable for what that creates.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right? But what they're saying is, no, you can't say fire. No, you can say whatever you want, but you got to be held accountable for what you say.
Yeah, it's just natural accountability. Don't go and lie to people.
Exactly.
There's consequences for it. Yeah.
So they got the free speech, and then they got the guns, and then they got the private ownership of land. I am tired of lawyers and academics saying, oh, the Magna Carta this and the Magna Carta that. In fact, the only good use of the term Magna Carta that I've seen in my lifetime is a company that's produced a little hand cart that you know folds up, and we bought one. It was sold through Canadian Tire, and it's called Magna Cart. I love that. That's wonderful. That's the only good. The other thing is that having taken seniors on tours around Europe, one of the best tourist jokes that I heard was at Runnymede, where the Magna Carta was signed. And the American tourist said to the tour guide, well, when did they sign this thing anyway? And the tour guide said 1216, and the guy said, darn, missed it by half an hour. But what was Magna Carta about? You go and look at the names of the 13 or so people that signed Magna Carta. They're all Norman nobles. I mentioned one earlier, Edward de Vere. They've all got that "de" in their name.
Yeah, right.
That it indicates nobility, and you know, because you own the land and the village and everything else. So what the Magna Carta was Prince Charles saying to the Queen, "I don't like what you're doing, Mum. Stop doing that." He still had the peasants and slaves on his property renting land. And paying the money. So. The Magna Carta being about anything to do with freedom is utter nonsense. Yeah. It wasn't until the American Constitution came in that the individual citizen could own land. Canadians don't understand it. They think, I bought this property. No, the government can take it back at any time and revert it to Crown property if they wish.
Yeah, because you also pay your property taxes, and if you don't pay your property taxes, it doesn't matter if you're debt free.
That's right. They'll take it away from you. Yeah. And by the way, of course, and get into this little bit of an example of how socialists deal with people that want to determine their own lives was in Quebec, where the people of Quebec had wanted to be a nation state, which under the rules of the Treaty of Versailles, they were perfectly legitimately doing, because they were a cultural group who had land. That's a nation state. Okay. Yeah. And of course, Trudeau, who was a socialist and wanted to keep the bigger government together, didn't want any parts breaking off. And of course, then we had the unfortunate instance of the kidnapping and the shooting. Trudeau used that to introduce the War Measures Act. Well, what was the War Measures Act? It completely delegitimized every single freedom of every individual, every part of it. And he used the Canadian Army against the Canadian people. Yeah. I mean, Trudeau, the great liberator and socialist.
Oh, yeah.
And so, you know, that's an example of it, the private ownership of land. That's under attack in the U.S.
Yeah.
There've been attempts
with the Bureau of Land Management.
Bureau of Land Management, the whole thing, and using the Water Rights Act, saying, "Oh, you've got water on your property, and it's polluted, even if it's only a puddle. Oh, it's polluted, therefore we can seize your land." So they've used the EPA's used the Water Rights Act to deal with it. So it's using the bureaucracies to end run the freedoms and the legislative processes, which of course is what Obama's done with his executive orders and everything else. But the third phase of the American Revolution is the access to information, and of course that's
which came with the internet.
And which with net neutrality, and so that's what you have to interpret for people what these guys are saying. Net neutrality was Obama saying, well, these internet providers are gouging you and they're ripping you off, and it's poor service, so government's got to look after you. Trust us.
Always trust the government. That gets you very far. Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's marvelous words, wasn't it? Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. It's the three most.
Yeah.
Or
There's
most
actually I seen the funny cartoons where he gives the person the money, and then you see it's in his back pocket and grabbing his money.
Yeah. Well, of course we saw that it really started significantly in the Diefenbaker era. Where they talked about the taxpayer and the citizen as two completely different people. But they were the same. They were taking the money out of one pocket and putting it in the other pocket.
Very much so.
But they created this illusion that these are two completely different people. We talked about society and how people think. I love to point out to people that all of the jokes, not so much now with political correctness, but mother-in-laws generally despised and looked down upon. But grandmothers, they're wonderful people. They're the same people. Right?
Yeah, there's some people.
Yet society has this super view of one and negative view of the other, and they never stop to think about those connections. So,
No, it's very interesting. I don't know if you can talk too much about what you actually are doing after the event.
I'm happy to talk about that.
You're actually visiting with Donald Trump's appointed EPA leader. So can you just give us a little bit of a rundown on what is the plan with the whole meeting?
It's kind of I've got to give a lead into it because the guy's name is Myron Ebell. That's Ebell, and he's been appointed by Trump to see the dismantling effectively of deregulating of the EPA, and also of getting the U.S. government out of the IPCC, the UN climate nonsense, withdrawing all the funding, because America's effectively been funding the UN and being kicked around, booted around no end by that agency. And it's the most corrupt agency. And it's proof, by the way, that my comment that the only thing that gets bigger with bigger government is corruption.
Yeah, exactly. You're
the
spot
larger
on.
it goes. Yeah.
It's what I've seen just recently. Me and Josh did a video that's coming out right now on the new super tax treaty that the OECD has just put out the 25th of November, and they're talking about how it is to come after the multinationals and so on. But when you really read into it, it's very much so for everybody.
Yeah, I'll step aside from the question about Washington for a minute, because there's an important concept here. And I first heard this in a speech in, of all places, Bismarck, North Dakota. And I was down there for the Northwest Farmers meeting. And the Northwest Farmers are a very powerful organization in the western United States. And the speaker had been the UN representative for the U.S. And he said, and this is almost 40 years ago now. He said, here's what's going to happen in the next 60 to 100 years. And he took a pen out of his pocket and he turned and said, if I sell you that pen, you have the pen, I no longer have the pen. A complete transferal of property. But he said, what's happening is, if I have an idea and I sell you the idea, you have the idea, but I still have the idea. Therefore, it's devalued by 50% right away. And he said the challenge is going to be, as ideas and services become more and more important in the world, the challenge is going to be retaining the value of the idea or the service, and yet still make money off of it. So he said you're going to see an absolute growth of intellectual property rights, of copyright. The TPP, 25% of it is devoted to precisely those things. And of course, China stealing everything, and that's the challenge. And of course, that's why Trump wants to get out of these multilateral treaties and go, every treaty will be one-on-one. So he can pull out of it without the whole thing tumbling down. So that was the idea. But anyway, back to why I'm going to Washington. And it's not Mr. Smith going to Washington, because it's beyond redemption. But I gave a talk to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is where Myron works. A lot of people call it libertarian, but it's actually a pro-development organization. And I was in Washington because I was summoned to appear before Congress. And Myron heard my talk. And of course, ever since, he's followed the whole climate issue. And I've met him several times at the Heartland climate conferences. Well, less than a month ago, I was in Australia because another person by the name of Malcolm Roberts, and one of the things that happens, and Malcolm's an engineer by training, he'd retired from business, started looking at banking, and because he'd had to deal with banks and how corrupt they were, and the Western or Wells Fargo fiasco is a good example.
We've all seen that.
Anyway, he got into the climate issue, couldn't believe what he was seeing. And what happens is as these people start to look at it, they think they're reading it wrong. It's so bad they can't believe that this is being done, that they're getting away with this. And so they tend to find others to confirm, are you seeing the same thing I am? And so they form groups. One of the first ones that I helped set up was in Calgary, Alberta. Now they had a couple of problems. One was, of course, they couldn't believe what they were reading, but they were also professional people, hydrologists, engineers, geologists. And of course, Calgary being the oil patch, and a lot of them had worked in the oil patch, so they had stigmas immediately. And so I flew to Calgary 12 years ago now, and we had to meet at the airport because they didn't want to be seen as a group. I'll tell you, the kind of paranoia that generates with this stuff. And anyway, so we met at the airport, and we formed the Friends of Science. I told them confirm what they were finding about the science of the climate and the politics of the climate. But then the other issue was, do we focus on the science or do we focus on the politics? Because one of the things is that scientists don't want anything to do with politics. They think, and correctly, that science should be apolitical and amoral. Now, the amoral thing creates a dilemma, right? Because I've never understood, and I used to talk with my students a lot about this, how do you as a scientist sit in a lab and design a weapon that you know is going to indiscriminately kill women and children? How do you justify that in your mind? And so, of course, the standard way of doing it is patriotism, which, of course, as Samuel Johnson said, is the last refuge of a scoundrel. But so the Friends of Science decided to stick strictly with the science, but their dilemma was that they formed because they were opposed to the Kyoto Protocol, which is a political structure built on the science. But anyway, they did pretty good job of sticking with the science and retain their credibility. But anyway, Malcolm Roberts in Australia called me, it's about 6 years ago now, and I helped him set up a thing called the Galileo movement. And I've got to tell you, a couple of highlights in my life. When I appeared before the Parliamentary Committee on the Ozone issue, and this other scientist was presenting data, and he says, here's the level of ozone over Toronto in 1996. And I did something I hope I never have to do again. I stopped and I said to the parliamentarians, I said, I hope you realize that there are no measurements of ozone over Toronto at that time.
Yeah, at that time,
it's
yeah,
computer generated stuff.
Yeah.
Now, he hasn't told you that, and I'm not going to question his motive.
Yeah.
I do know he's getting funding from the government, okay? And of course, they didn't realize that, but the politicians didn't realize. So I said, this is not real data. This is computer generated.
Yeah, generated back in time.
Exactly.
Proposed.
Yeah,
outcome,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And anyway, this Maureen Catterall, who one pundit called Maureen Catterwall, she said, Dr. Paul, Galileo would be ashamed of you. And I said, Madam, to be mentioned in the same sentence as Galileo is the greatest compliment you could pay me. And clearly you don't understand his role in the history of science, of challenging the prevailing wisdom and the authorities and the power. By the way, Galileo tried to do what other scientists have done, and that is not write in the language of the day. The language of science of the day was Latin. Mm-hmm. And Galileo published in Italian because he hoped he could jump past the authorities to the people.
Gotcha, yeah.
And if the people would support him. And it did work to some extent because they only put him under house arrest. They didn't put him in jail.
Yeah.
You know, it's a
a
minor victory, but nonetheless. Yeah. Anyway, I've forgotten where I was going.
Yeah, so back to you going to the United States.
Sorry, that's yes, yeah. I'm so easily led.
No worries, no
well,
worries.
my mother always said that, Tim's easily led, yeah. I think she meant something different by that, but anyway. So Malcolm set up the Galileo movement, and then about 3 years ago, we were talking about what he could do, and he decided to run for political office. Now that's a very, very brave thing to do. And the reason I say that is because when Maurice Strong presented his ideas about getting rid of the industrialized nations, when he was interviewed by Elaine Dewar, who was an investigative reporter for the Hamilton Spectator, he said, yeah, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Well, she said, well, why don't you run for politics? And he probably gave the only honest answer he ever gave in his lifetime. He said, you can't do anything as a politician. And then she said, well, what are you going to do? And this is actually quoted in the book. She spent 5 days with him, by the way. And he said, no, I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. Right?
Yeah, and we all know what Maurice Strong has done, yeah.
Oh, of course, yeah. And I mean, yeah. And died in China because the U.S. government wanted him for fraud, because he and his son made money off the oil for food in Iraq crisis. So Maurice Strong, it's like all of those socialists.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
You can't make money, but I'm going to make money. You know, it's like Castro's died now. With what?
Oh,
5
yeah,
billion?
and we all know what our good friend Justin Trudeau had to say. He's been mocked all over with Trudeau eulogies. Has been flooding the internet. Yeah. No,
but by the way, to go to the other end of the political spectrum, they got the same idea, and that's what we talked about earlier. The elites on the left and the right. But Conrad Black somebody said to him, "Why aren't you in politics?" And he said, I don't need to be. And that's one of those comments that it just slowly and suddenly it explodes on you.
Yeah, and what's funny actually, Josh Sigurdson, which is our other partner at World Alternative Media, he actually confronted Conor Black.
Oh yeah.
And Conor Black after that got actually Foerster and McNally Robinson. He's not welcome there anymore.
Okay.
But Josh asked the question, did you guys ever talk about the European Union in the Bilderberg meetings? And later we actually got to look into the documents, and they were talking lots about creating this European Union. Yeah. So, but back to what you're doing.
So
in the
anyway,
United States.
Malcolm ran for politics, but he had a huge opportunity. And I'm by the way, I'm a great believer in serendipity and manifest destiny. If something's supposed to happen, it will.
Yeah.
And a new party had formed, and this is part of, on a global scale, the part of the middle class revolution that Trump has performed
in the U.S. Yeah.
Because a woman by the name of Pauline Hanson realized that people were tired of the old political labels of socialist and conservative, because virtually everybody, particularly in the middle, find themselves conservative on some issues and socialist on others, and they don't find a party that fills that bill. The liberals pretend that they do. It's sort of like the Globe and Mail pretends that it's balanced.
Yeah.
And the one thing that everybody hates is hypocrisy. It's like I always say, better the bigot in front of me than the liberal behind me, because at least I know where the guy's coming from. I can deal with that. And anyway, so Malcolm ran for the party was called the One Nation Party in Australia. And it's been very successful. And Malcolm ran for Queensland and got elected there. And part of what he was trying to do, and I gave him some information on it, was an Indian company wants to start a coal mine in Queensland. And of course the Greens are trying to shut it down. The Prime Minister of India said, hey, and he trumped the moral high ground for the Greens, because he said, look, I got a third of my people don't even have electricity. So what are you telling me?
Yeah.
That the global warming might occur and you're not certain? And I got to let these people, and he said, I got starving people.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's another part of it. But Malcolm ran, and his maiden speech, which people can get on YouTube, was all about the other issue we started to talk about 3 years ago, and that is, where's your empirical evidence? Now, to help people understand, we touched on this earlier, empirical evidence is actual evidence and the mechanism that creates that evidence. So you can have data, but if you don't know what the underlying mechanism is, you can't possibly interpret that data, right? It's just like having a bunch of numbers.
Yeah.
Or even a bunch of words. I mean, I could say to you, foreshore, backshore, berm, zone, swash zone, all these. You say, well, what's that? Well, those are all parts of a beach. Oh, okay. Now I've got a collective place to put them. Okay, and so anyway, for the first time that I'm aware of, a politician actually challenged the bureaucracy, not other politicians, because they won't do it. And Malcolm actually said to the CSIRO, which is the agency set up to handle climate change for the Australian government, and they work through the Bureau of Meteorology, and he said, okay, I want a report showing your empirical evidence. I don't want computer model output, which was the issue we talked about earlier. And of course, they came up with a report, and my comment about it was that it's an insult to sophomores to call it sophomoric. They didn't produce any evidence. All they did was repeat what the IPCC were saying. It was the computer model output again. And then they trotted out this guy, Bryan, who was a young physicist who BBC, therefore automatically left-wing. And he comes on and he's got this graph, and he says, oh, here's the temperature going up. See, there's the empirical evidence. Well, I mean, how stupid can you be? It's a graph of a temperature going up. That's not empirical evidence. And not only that, but we were able to show that they made the temperature go up by cooking the data.
Yeah.
They'd falsified the data. And so we finally got a report, and I just read it this morning, as a matter of fact, from the bureaucracy. And of course, they simply can't produce the empirical evidence. Well, out of that, the people in Washington were watching, and we were in communication. Malcolm and his staff were in communication. And Tony Heller, who's the guy that showed how they cooked the temperature data record, they eliminated the warm period from 1940 to 1970 and leveled it out like this. And in Australia, they took the record, which was warm in the 1880s, and then went down to a cool period around 1910, and then went up here. Well, they started their temperature record here. And said, look, there's the warming.
Yeah.
And so anyway, what evolved from all of that was that Myron said, hey, we need to have this presentation made in Washington. And so Tony, and what we did in Australia, and again, you can get this on the YouTube, Tony said, okay, here's how they cook the data. And then I step up and say, okay, why would scientists cook data? What's going on here? And then I provide the whole Club of Rome, Maurice Strong, and the whole
the whole elitist background that is playing against us here.
Yeah. So that's why I'm off to Washington. I got to tell you, I wasn't even going to come to this Freedom Conference and or go to Washington initially, but my wife and I said, no, it's this, you waited 40 years for this opportunity, and so I just had to do it.
Yeah, no, I'm very pleased and very excited for you that you were able to do this. You really achieved some great things through your life. And
well, the price you pay. And I'm not crying here at all. I knew I went into all this eyes wide open. The only thing I misjudged is just how nasty it would get, how vicious it would get.
Yeah.
And by the way, I guess you could argue that I've got a hint of the rebel or what's the term? Somebody who challenges things all the time.
Yeah.
But anyway, because I was in the Canadian military, and if there was something really stupid,
You stood up to it.
I stood up. Yeah. For example, when I was on the squadron, you had to pay into the squadron fund. That was regulations, and every time they had an event, they would subsidize the booze. And at one of the squadron meetings, I said, look, why don't we subsidize the food? All you're doing is promoting alcoholism.
Yeah.
And what about the people that don't drink? And of course that got me bad references. And so I ended up as being the longest in the rank of lieutenant in the whole history of the Canadian military. and I'm perverse enough to take pride in that.
Yeah.
And then at the university, of course, again, if there was stupidity, I would speak out about it. And so I ended up being the longest in the lowest rank of assistant professor in the history of Canadian universities.
Wow.
So those are two of my badges of honor.
Yeah, so I guess that's the rebel in you that came out.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting. My dad had a little bit of it, but the west of England, where I come from, has a history of challenging authority. I mean, the Toll Puddle martyrs and the people that broke up the looms. What were they called? The Luddites.
Yeah.
They were all West Country people, and many of the people that challenged the monarchy were all from the West Country. So I come from an area of a long history of challenging authority and not putting up with authority.
Yes.
So I don't know whether that's part of it or all of it, but
it probably is a little bit in your DNA. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things that bothers me, I used to kind of understand it because the number of people that would come up to me, like I gave a talk in Winnipeg one time, and there were 3 Environment Canada people came up after, and they said, look, we agree with you, but we daren't speak out. Well, I say, aren't we in a democracy? Whatever happened to free speech?
Yeah.
And of course, it's a myth. It's an absolute myth. And then of course, why do we have to pass whistleblower laws in a society where you've got free speech? Why do you need to protect people that are going to tell you about crime? And but these are the sorts of anomalies and contradictions that people just slide right by and don't think about.
Yeah. So what, just to break it down for our viewers at the end here. So really, when people stand up to their leaders is when they've been infringed on their rights, and it's when of course the most important things in our lives, which is food and water, gets in little supply. You were talking about the cycles in Egypt. Every 300 years, there was rainfall cycles and so on and this just comes down to the importance. We need to understand that we need to prepare ourselves. We need to take care of ourselves, and just be prepared for having to survive through calamity, because we are getting at the precipice right now. We're definitely there, and now with Trudeau in Canada is making a fool out of everybody, and I believe Canada might be the next one to step up. I really hope so, to step up to the plate and change things.
Well, of course, Trudeau does things because he's a sycophant. I mean, he's already announced he's prepared to renegotiate NAFTA. Well, where were you when you ran for office saying that? But
he's a politician. We got to understand.
That's right.
They just say whatever they can.
Yes, it's that lovely joke about the politician that says, "Look, I've got a very strong set of principles, but if you don't like those, I've got another set over here." It's that kind of duplicity.
Yeah.
But I think that in human evolution, if you think about the American Revolution, how recent that was, and what's interesting to me is both the two forms of government, socio-economic governments that we've evolved, capitalism and communism, both started at about the same time, because capitalism is effectively Darwinism. It's survival of the fittest, and the most successful move to the top, and so on. Communism, of course, the Marxist Manifesto appears about 9 years before Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. So that's just really as far as we've gone in terms of our understanding and development as a political animal and as an economic animal. And so there are all kinds of other models. And as I said, the American revolutionary model is really now just coming to a complete fruition with the access to information.
There's lots of system, and we here at World Alternative Media, we promote what's called voluntarism and individualism, because we think it's very important for people, if they want their type of society. I'm not going to go over and bother them and infringe their rights or push any laws on them. They can live over there by themselves if they want to. If they want to impose laws on each other, you're more than welcome, but you should be free to be able to go out of that society if you want to. And that's what we have today. We can't just opt out of today's government's system.
And you see the confusion in people's minds that they don't even think about. In 1 minute you'll hear somebody saying, "Oh, there's too much government, too much taxes, we got to reduce." And then about a half an hour later they're saying, "Why doesn't the government do something about this?" So it just flies right by them. And by the way, I used to play tricks in my classroom all the time, pedagogical tricks, but they were done to help people understand what was going on. And I mean, for example, I do a lot of cross sections in science. You're always doing a cross section through something, and geography is cross section. So I said, look, A and B and X and Y, they're always getting the cross sections. It's time for the other letters to have a chance. We need alphabetical democracy here. But it's trickery, but it helps them understand and makes a game out of it, and they relate to it. So that, keeping the sense of humor and understanding the larger scale of things. But here's the one thing that I've always done consistently, is I know that the minute you give people power, it will become corrupted. Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which, by the way, is followed by the sentence that very, very rarely gets quoted, which says, "And most great men are bad men." That never gets quoted, that part, because of course it speaks to the elitism thing. But anyway, just to give you an example of how I've tried to live by the code, and of course it doesn't make you friends. But the university, we had a president who was signing individual contracts with individual faculty members, and favorites got more money than others, And say, well, okay, if they were better, if it was based on a merit reason, we could live with that, but it wasn't. It was pure, favoritism. But anyway, we found out the only way we could stop it was to have a contract. And the only way we could get a contract, and this is what the socialist governments had set up, was you had to form a union. So I said, okay, expediency, I'll play the game. And so we formed a union, and I worked as the secretary and got it all organized. And we worked very hard, and we finally got a contract, and we signed the contract, and everything was fine. And within 2 weeks, I started a group to get rid of the union. Right? and people say, "Oh, there's that crazy Tim Bullock." And I said, I guarantee you, within 2 years, you'll all be complaining about the unions out of control and power. So that's what you have to do. That the minute you give power, you must immediately start reminding the people of the limits of that power.
100%. And we totally forget that today.
Yeah.
No, it's so important, and that's why we need to warn people about what we talked about here. It's the infringement of people's rights, and when we actually just give them this power, they have the ultimate power over you, and they create more power, and then suddenly you're in a totalitarian state where you have nothing left, and then people stand up. That's what
right.
we talked about. And that's the rise and fall of empires.
Yeah. Let me narrow that down to the individual, and by the way, I'm going to talk about this in my talk tomorrow. But two people get together for whatever reason, you have a relationship. They each sacrifice something, but they make a decision: is what I'm gaining more than what I'm sacrificing? So it's worth losing those things. But you bring a third person in and a fourth person. Each person lose more and more, and then when you've got a large group, there is no individual freedom left. And that's the problem with the size of the group that you're in, and why the one world government simply cannot work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's that concept. But talking about the power you have as an individual, I had a dean who knew that I wanted tenure at the university. I loved teaching. I wanted to stay at the university. Couldn't stay there without tenure, and I was working on my PhD at the same time as teaching. Every time he saw me, he said, "How's that famous PhD going?" And I knew it was the needle. It was the power trip. And one day I was talking to my wife about it, and she said, next time he says it, just tell him you've quit the PhD. Tell him you're not doing it anymore. And I said, "Oh, I can't do that. I'll never get the tenure." She said, "It doesn't matter. We'll live. We'll survive." and by the way, that's why I sacrificed some of my freedom to be with that woman. But anyway, that's another side of the story. And I'll never forget. It was at 11 o'clock in the morning, May 22nd, 1983, and I'm going up the escalator at the University of Winnipeg, and here comes the dean down the other. "Oh, how's that famous PhD going?" I said, "Oh, haven't you heard? I'm not doing it anymore. I quit." "Oh, you can't do that. You're our best teacher. We need you here." I said, "How come I got to die before you appreciate me? How come John Lennon's got to get shot before people start?"
Isn't that the true?
And I suddenly realized I had given him the power over me.
Yeah.
And only I could take it back again. And in doing that, and in doing that, that's what I achieved. But it takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage because, we're all weak and feeble, and we need people once in a while.
It's very tough to stand up and really speak your mind, because I remember so many times where I've had presentations on the monetary system, and I had people standing up and yelling at you. You just feel it.
Yes, okay. But and I tell people, I said, if you want to try it, just go out and the next group you're in, just say, that global warming, that's a bunch of rubbish. They'll just say,
No, so
and by the way, people that know nothing about it, of course.
Because they just have heard a couple of talking points, and that's how they connect with things and think that's the truth. But I would just want to finish up here so we don't go too long. But it was so much fantastic information. I really appreciate your time, Tim Ball. You've been a blast to be together with today, and I've gained a lot of knowledge talking to you as well. So I just want to thank you so much for being on our show here at World Alternative Media. This is John Sneisen and Tim Ball signing up for World Alternative Media. We want to make sure that you go to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and you could check out our Patreon and GoFundMe, because we can't do this without you good people. And also now we have an great promotion for an Acapulco with Jeff Berwick, where you get 10% off by signing up from under the WAM, that's VAM, and you get 10% off. You save money, we get a little bit of money. So stay tuned for more. We're coming back at you with lots more here from Phoenix, Arizona. This is John Sneisen signing up from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
Thank you.